Unmute, Paul.
We're still not hearing you, Paul.
Paul, we do not hear anything. Can you type something in the chat so that we know that you hear us? Thanks.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, we got you now.
All right. Wow, sorry about the confusion there, but I thought the earphones would help to make things better, and that's not necessarily the case. Let's see if we get the screen sharing here.
We have it.
We have Jerry Grover on, okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it's Valentine's Day, and I recognize that just as a statement of love, the fact that you're here on the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum is perhaps one of those finer statements of love, because to love the scriptures and to love the message that they offer is, I think, one of the higher expressions of it. And so I'm going to ask for a bit of indulgence in that regard here in a little bit, but let me first of all introduce our presenter, our guest. Jerry Grover is the author of many publications available on the Book of Mormon. They're available on the Book of Mormon Central website, and you'll see there the translation of the characters document that he's made, the geology on the Book of Mormon, which he's presenting on this evening, which will give us a beautiful representation of the volcanoes and their activity as related to the Book of Mormon geography. He has Ziph, magic goggles, and the golden plates, the Nephite Great Spirit religion and the Amalekite religion, the travel path of the Jaredites, evidence of the Nehor religion in Mesoamerica, and the Swords of Shul. The Swords of Shul is another major work. I want to invite him back on that one, probably take at least 2 sessions on that one, because he really gets into a remarkable study of the Olmec Jaredite parallels. And I've given a presentation on that myself, but his presentation is far more in depth than mine. These are all available. The books are all available for download at no cost. I would also point out that Jerry has sponsored and published the remarkable linguistic work by Brian Stubbs, interrelating the Semitic fascicular cognates with those of the Uto-Aztecan family. We had a couple of presentations on that a couple of months ago. I'm delighted that he's become available. He was not available for most of the first year of our presentations, but he has participated with insightful comments and questions recently, and he stepped in to fill an opportunity in October to present on the illumination of a day and a night and a day. And now here he comes to provide a very instructive session on the role of volcanoes in the Book of Mormon. Thank you, Jerry, for sharing with us tonight. And tonight we're going to learn more about the volcanoes in the Book of Mormon. And I will have a picture in the background of a volcano that we got to visit on the island of Moorea. And with that, let me introduce the prayer. Well, before I go though, can we verify that Jerry has gotten on? I didn't see him before I started.
Yes, Paul, he's on.
All right, let us pray. Creator of the oceans of space, of water, of land, of fire. We stand on our islands, looking at the vastness of your creation, and inquire, how can you see us, so insignificant in the spectrum of everything you have made, meriting the focus of an eternal plan that you have laid. We bow before you this evening with a presentation on Book of Mormon geology, attempting to understand the possible role of volcanology. So we ask your blessing on our presenter, Jerry Grover, that his words might communicate and that we can gain understanding to help us celebrate. And on this day in which we celebrate love, we ask your blessing from above, that our relationships all be amicable as our friendships grow, and that we learn from each other the things you would have us know. For we want to celebrate your word, to acknowledge your invitation, to let your voice be heard and be expressed in our lives as my children blessed, surrounded by angels as though by fire, to join the kingdom of Zion in harmony with the angel choir. Amen. Now, I do want to ask a special privilege as the host, because I want to give a special note of tribute to my Temperotu Rina Faura de Barth wife, my Valentine. The first was a cactus with an inverted spine 52 years ago to declare you mine. You affirmed. I saw your eyes shine, and our lives then began to intertwine. 51 years, now nearly 52, since we affirmed our vows, you to love me, mine to love you. And I affirm them again today, glad that you are still mine. In spite of my cactus thorns, you are my Valentine. Thank you for allowing me to be indulged that way. And I'll shut off the
We all love you too, Rena.
all right. Yeah. Well, thank you. The rest of you that want to share my Valentine, I'm happy to share her love. She is awesome. All right, Jerry, the floor is yours, and please take it easy on us, because the eruption of all these volcanoes could hide some things.
Okay, sharing the screen. Can you all see the my screen now?
Yep, we got
I
it.
see
Thank
a
you.
book of geology of the Book of Mormon.
Okay. Well, this isn't going to be quite as emotionally moving as Paul's introduction and his Valentine message, but
That looks like lightning from Chile.
it actually is. That's the volcano that erupted down
I
there.
recognize it.
Yeah, some years ago, 2015, I wrote a book, Geology of the Book of Mormon. And so I kind of addressed a lot of, people had always recognized there were earthquakes, potential volcano, Mormon, but there had really been no attempt to actually fly it on the ground, try to
You
identify
have a little box right over there. You can stick that stuff in.
what it was. So this book was an attempt to actually take that. And I also, in this presentation, I'll have a bit more to try to identify the volcano and look at all the elements of the destruction in the cities, and also try to see if we could identify basically whether there needed to be a fault system involved. So a little bit of this will be some geology 101, meaning I'm going to talk a little bit just about generic things in geology, but again, the scope of the book was to provide explanation for all the geological events in the Book of Mormon, get it on the ground, and then actually it can be used as a parameter to look at different geographic models. In this book, I looked at the Sorensen model primarily to see whether it fit the geological parameters of the Book of Mormon that are found in the Book of Mormon. Just a basic geology lesson. Basically, the Earth is made of differing plates, crustal plates. Plate tectonics is the movement of those plates. There's spreading areas that spread where the plates are separating from each other. There's volcanic activity along those, a different type of volcanic activity. Then there are areas where the plates are being subducted or going underneath other plates. And that's where you generate volcanoes that are kind of your explosive type volcanoes. In Mesoamerica, it's actually kind of complex, the geology there. You have a Cocos plate to the south It's moving underneath both the Caribbean plate and the North American plate. Can you see my cursor? I'm hoping the Caribbean plate's over here, North American plate's here, the Cocos plate's down here. The North American plate, and I'll show this a little bit, is actually rotating against the Caribbean plate as long as well as having subduction going underneath it from the Cocos plate. These purple areas here are called the volcanic arcs. Your volcanoes form off of subduction zones in a certain distance. This would be a cross section where you have the Cocos plate going underneath. You actually get the melting of the magma. It comes up in big blobs called diapirs into magma chamber, and then you have your volcano off of the subduction zone. The movement, I kind of mentioned that it's a little complicated in Mesoamerica, and we're specifically looking kind of in this area here, not really going down into Panama or anything. Looking, the Sorensen model has the Isthmus of Tehuantepec as a narrow neck. But you have a fault system here called the Veracruz fault system, which is considered a strike slip, and we'll talk about that. There's also kind of a step over fault down here, the Matogua, that runs down through this neck of the woods. So then if you're looking at this is a map of the earthquakes measured along, in Mesoamerica. Little beach balls are just basically the orientation of the fault. So, and there's also the depth. The color tells you the depth. As you can see, you have some activity, some very large earthquakes have occurred along the Veracruz fault, some down in here, and then the subduction zone has a lot of earthquakes because what you have is the plate that's going on as it gets pushed underneath the other plate, it's moving. So that's the definition of an earthquake, is just earth moving against each other. These tend to be very deep though, because the subduction zone goes down in depth. The strike slip, as you can see, these little arrows are telling you that this moves this direction, this part of the fault, the other side of the fault moves that direction. And a strike slip, we're all familiar with the California San Andreas fault. That's a strike slip fault principally. Talk just a little bit about. And this is the Sorensen model itself. As you can see, you've got the narrow neck here, your Camorra up in here, desolation, and basically the Valley of Guatemala. Guatemala City is this, your Nephi here. This is Upper Chiapas. The highlands of Chiapas is your Zarahemla area. And he's got Ammonaya over here. We'll talk about that later. When you're looking at as a geologist, or I'm actually also a geological engineer, sometimes you're asked to do hazard analysis on different geological risks, whether it's landslide, debris flows. In areas where there are volcanoes, of course, you will look at what are the hazards of a volcano, and then through urban planning or other things, try to make sure that you're not building within a certain distance of volcano, and looking at other parameters of volcano that can cause hazards to the population. Volcanoes have a variety of different types of ways that damage can occur, either to loss of life or property loss. Pyroclastic flows, volcanic debris slides, lahars, which are basically mud flows that come out in drainage patterns, meaning where rivers are out away from the volcano. You have the ash and tephra. Tephra is kind of just a little rocks. Volcanic earthquakes. You have earthquakes can occur adjacent to volcanoes or as part of the magma chamber collapse. Tsunamis, if they're adjacent to the water or in the water. Lava flows, and volcanic lightning and thunder. This is an example of pyroclastic flow. It's basically superheated ash and steam and gases that travel at very high speeds. That truck probably has a some geologist in there that got too close. But they come out and they're a very, what you call the highest cause of death are these types of volcanoes. Lahar is these large mud flows that form. Oftentimes you'll have a volcano that's capped with snow that will, immediately melt and generate these mud flows. Or if you have volcanoes with high groundwater associated with them, they also have water available, which will then mix with the ash and just run as a big concrete, like it's liquid concrete, basically. This one, you have the volcano clear back here. You can see the little cloud. This is 35 kilometers away. This is a suspension bridge going across what used to be a river basin. And you can see it just, the Rio Tambor just filled up with material. You have whirlwinds that come off of these pyroclastic flows. Often after the flow passes, then it's followed by superheated air that can then form whirlwinds. This particular one wouldn't be like enough to lift a car, not like a tornado, but still you can get some pretty powerful winds. And as we saw in the first page, you get this volcano lightning, which is pretty spectacular. And as Mormon, mentioned, it did have sharpened lightning. So it's quite something to behold. So that was kind of talking about volcanic hazards of volcanoes. Then we'll talk about earthquake hazards. There are different types of earthquakes. There's some that slip up, and like where the hanging block is what they call it, goes up. That's a reverse fault. This is the hanging block. Goes down, and that's a normal fault. And then you have a strike slip, which is movement, lateral or horizontal. The strike slip faults actually have a lot of surface features, cracks, and everything associated with them. The others do too, to some extent, but the strike slips are known for all these complex crack and fracture structures, which actually is indicated in the Book of Mormon description. What we're trying to do here is actually identify kind of the best fit for what happened in the Book of Mormon with the geological explanation. So I may talk about that from time to time, just the best fit, most plausible. Also associated with earthquakes, and this has been mentioned in prior discussions, you have failure. It's not actually the cracking of the earth at the fault itself, it's away from the fault, but the earthquake generates surface waves and also pressure waves. Just like you have a line of ping pong balls and you hit one end and another ping pong ball pops out the other side. It's basically you have a pressure, a wave of pressure that goes through. When it hits super saturated soils, or some soils even not so saturated, they basically turn to jello. Or the pore space of the water goes into the pore spaces, fills the pore spaces. And so you have what's called lateral spreading, where you maybe have a hill and it just slumps off. The liquefaction is where we call that when it basically you have soil that actually has bearing strength, but then when it becomes liquefied, it has no bearing strength. And as you can see, the buildings just collapse or mush into it, just like it's a jello. Now, when we look at the third Levi event, one thing we don't obviously didn't have seismometers at that time or any ways of measuring it, but you did have descriptions of destruction. Based on that description of destruction, there's what's called the Mercalli scale that we use that actually estimate the size, the power or strength of the earthquake. Now you have the Richter scale on the very left, which a lot of people are familiar with. It's not really used as much as it used to be, but it's still what most people are familiar with. And then you have these Roman numeral ratings of the Mercalli scale. And so you have slight up in here, like a 3. You notice it's noticeable indoors. They say it's like vibration similar to the passing of a truck. And evaluating what happened in the Book of Mormon, you're looking at really an 8, either high 7 or 8 to above, because you have destruction, this one, 7 is damage in negligible damage in buildings of good design and construction, but considerable damage in poorly built or badly designed structures. Now, I'm not saying that in Mesoamerica, all of the temples were poorly designed, but it is an ancient techniques in that, so it really doesn't have like, earthquake ties or anything like that. It's basically either wood structures or concrete / stone structures, and reinforced. They aren't really reinforced like reinforced concrete or something. So we're looking at, these are kind of modern terms. So you're really looking at an 8 and above. And that will be important as we get along here. So in the hazard analysis, basically what I had in the book, we're not going to go through it all. We'll kind of discuss some of it, but there are a series of hazards that are listed there in the third Nephite event. Exceedingly sharp lightning, earth carried up over other earth where a great mountain was formed, which is an interesting way to describe something. Whirlwinds, great quaking of the whole earth, land deformation. It does mention a lot of the damage was in the land northward, so we'll look at that. You have, of course, the vapor of darkness, mists of darkness, sinking, and other things. Another thing we have to kind of establish from the Book of Mormon is as you know, it starts out, discusses the great storm. There's a mention of the great storm that occurred initially. And so it's helpful to actually kind of do a disaster timeline, get the timelines down. So then when we look at the event, we can see what's going on, or at least evaluate what the possibilities might be. One thing that I'm not going to get into the dates here. Obviously, I gave a presentation of research I've done since this book, but we know that Christ died in March or April, the Passover time. The year itself doesn't matter, but the seasonality does, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. You had a great storm that arose with destructive forces lasting 3 hours. Some of the destructive forces occurred intermittently throughout the 3 hours, other continuously, the way it discusses it. After the storm, after the 3 hours of the storm, there was darkness upon the face of the land for 3 days. And then many hours before the end of the 3 days, summary of the destruction of various cities was provided by the voice of Jesus Christ. And then during the full 3-day period of darkness, it mentions trembling of the earth, rending of the rocks, dreadful groanings, and tumultuous noises, which all ended after 3 days. So one of the things to look at, this isn't really geology, it's more meteorology, but one of the questions is, could the great storm have been a hurricane? One of the issues you have is seasonality. So I looked at, as part of this book, I went through all of the tropical storms and hurricanes and the tracking of them back to 1842 to see whether, the seasonality of the hurricane events. And 97% of them occur between June 1st and November 30th. There were only 8 in that entire period of time that occurred before May. And of course, we're looking for an March, April timeframe. So hurricane does not really look to be a good plausible fit for the great storm. And in addition, you have to travel. It's a fast storm because it's basically 3 hours is all that the storm is discussed. And that would have to be a very fast moving hurricane to get through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And fast hurricanes are known, but they are significantly less powerful. So then one of the questions is about the great storm is, we have the descriptions which seem to fit, a volcanic eruption, the tumultuous noises, the mists of darkness being the ash. But one point people bring up, this is actually not in the book, this is research since the book, but is a volcano actually mentioned in the Book of Mormon? That's one reason people kind of don't say, oh, okay, this Mesoamerican model, why are you assuming that? One of the reasons is there are no volcanoes in Israel There is a volcanic field, which I'll talk about later in relation to Lehi. But in biblical Hebrew, they don't have it. In Egyptian, you don't have it either. So great storm would be a likely word to be utilized to describe it. In Ezekiel's vision, which basically it's been proposed that maybe he was observing a volcanic eruption to the north, because he talks about, I mean, in conjunction with his vision, I'm not saying that it describes the whole vision, but there were ball lightning and things like that. That's mentioned as, that's translated as a storm in many translations of the Hebrew. Also, when we'll get into it, the 1792-93 eruption of the San Martin volcano in the isthmus. At the time, it's a volcano that's often shrouded in clouds. It's not observable. Maybe the eruption itself, the initial, may not even be observable as a separate, event because of the cloud cover. And the locals actually in that eruption described it as a large or great storm that occurred. So then another thing is there actually probably is a mention of a volcano in the Book of Mormon, if you understand the Mesoamerican setting of the Book of Mormon. The Tower of Sherazah, which is mentioned in the epistle, Mormon's epistle, which Moroni included in his book, it talks about the Tower of Sherazah, their prisoners. A lot of people says, oh, this is just some big, wooden tower or something, but I don't think it's talking about that at all. Sherazah is derived from the biblical name Sherazur or Sherazur, which is a Hebrew transliterated loan name from Zend, which is a language, I think, from Persia, and it means Prince of Fire. So essentially, and then I also look at Sherazah, because I actually had another book about just sometimes a lot of the names in the Book of Mormon, in fact, many of the Jaredite ones, looks like they're constructed from Sumerian words, and you can construct Sherazah to basically mean derived from a bright red poured out paste, kind of a lava reference. And then the correlation of Prince of Fire is also interesting because in Mesoamerica and Aztec mythology, the Aztec god was known as the Lord of Fire and was the god of fire, day and heat, and volcanoes, and was also named Flame. And he's usually depicted as a young deity, so Prince of Fire would be an appropriate name for the volcano. And what's happening there is you have, in the Book of Mormon, they're basically using these calques, meaning you have a word that maybe exists, means something in the Native Mesoamerican language, whatever it is, but they're not using that word. They're not transliterating, they're just using what's called a calque. So they're taking the meaning in the existing language and translating it into their, and constructing a name in their, or assigning it a name in their own language, or biblical language. Okay, so then the question is, that's been one question people have as well. It's just a volcano, or was it some earthquake or fault system? So the first question I try to answer is, could a volcanic eruption explain all of the elements of the destruction? The answer is basically no, because volcanic earthquakes are usually not that powerful. I mean, they're powerful like at the volcano, but they don't extend very far away. And there's an equation here, which, you're not going to be quizzed on it or anything, but there's a Russian fellow geologist named Zobin who actually created a formula so you can calculate the volcanic earthquakes based on intensity and distance, which is important, and I'll get to that later when we're looking at, especially when we're trying to figure out if there's damage this far away from the volcano, could that have been caught? Could the volcano cause that damage? And so these are called shake maps. So I just took which is the highest power of a volcano, like we mentioned, is this magnitude 7. These are what's called shake maps. So they actually have measured the shaking. And these are not volcanic earthquakes. These are just earthquakes, but they're 7 to 7.8. And so you can say, okay, can a 7 get us to the Mercalli value of 8, which we need to explain the collapse of cities? And the answer is, as you can see, no, it only generates and only very locally up to a 6, maybe into a 7. So it's kind of showing that basically a volcano, although it's part of the Third Nephi destruction, it's not sufficient. You have to have some sort of regional earthquake system or fault system. Well, that will require, if that's the case, that you actually have to have a simultaneous eruption with the earthquake at the same time. So the question is there such a thing? And the answer is yes, they actually do occur. And they have certain parameters that are usually found with them. One of the principal ones, I mean, the Mesoamerica meets pretty much all, it's part of the Ring of Fire. Actually, if you measure the earthquake activity before Christ there, from what we know, the volcanic activity, excuse me, it was less. And then, so it kind of meets that criteria. And then the most common events are when the earthquake is near the volcano. And what I did is when you actually evaluate earthquakes too, you have to evaluate the effect off of the fault. So it's called an attenuation zone or attenuation factor. And so that way we can look, if we're trying to lay this into Mesoamerica, we need to know, okay, we have a fault system. What type of distance away from the fault would you expect certain levels of damage, these intensities? There wasn't really anything in the isthmus. Nobody had done, because it takes millions of dollars to generate these equations, because you have to have seismometers and measuring them. But there was up near southern Mexico, in the area, the south of Mexico City, they had developed these formulas. So I use these to calculate along the fault systems how much distance you would have. If I assumed basically a Richter 11 earthquake at the fault, how far off of it would you get to this Mercalli top 7 or 8? So that just tells you the range of that you would expect where you'd have the damage described in the Book of Mormon to have occurred. Doesn't mean that there isn't shaking other places, but at least your city collapses are going to be happening in here, the destruction of buildings. So that was the question: which fault system are we looking at? You really have the Veracruz fault and you have the subduction zone fault. As you can see, most of the type of shaking you would have on the subduction zone fault is either out in the ocean or along just the flank here. So it does not look to be really that. You also had this description in the Book of Mormon of plains being broken up, and there are plains in here, flatter areas, there really aren't on here. So basically the best fit is that you have the Veracruz fault system is probably your fault system. You know, you may have down into here this step over fault too. But again, most of your damage is in the land northward, and I'm applying to the Sorensen model. So their land northward basically is basically this area. So then I looked at each of the volcanoes. I spent a lot of time going through every single volcano and basically the Central America, looking at, you had to have an eruption in the proper time frame. And again, this is radiometric dating. It's not going to be an exact date because you have a range, but you have to have one that's going to fall, an eruption documented. Now, I would have a caveat there. Some volcanoes didn't have very good data. I mean, they hadn't sampled a lot of things. So there may be eruptions that we don't have any data on. But in the land northward, there were only 3 that met that criteria: San Martin, Pico de Orizaba, and Popocatépetl, which is the one near Mexico City. And there was one further to the south in the central, El Chicon, which erupted in 82. So it looked like, it did look like the San Martin was one to look at because it was more centrally located. It was still in the land northward, but it's centrally located. Because one of the parameters is you have to have the south also covered with mist of darkness. So if you're clear up by Mexico City, although you have meteorological conditions and maybe you could push it all the way down. Again, we're looking at a best fit, most plausible. The San Martin And actually, the San Martin is the best candidate also because it sits right on the fault system. Actually, the shape of the volcano and the magma chambers, et cetera, actually are following the structure of the fault. So it's actually moving up the fault system. When the magma and the lava move up, they're following fault systems. So that this is the Tuxtla Mountains. Tuxtla, the San Martin is the main volcano. It's a volcanic field, but the main volcano is located right there. Okay, so like I mentioned, it seems to be the best fit. It's located on the fault. The other thing that this volcano has is because it's actually a high amount of rainfall. It's one of the most highest rainfall in the region. And it's called a phreatomagnetic volcano because what happens because of all the groundwater and high water, when you have these eruptions, there's these huge explosions. You probably have maybe been following the Tonga eruption that happened out in the Pacific. And they heard all kinds of sonic booms, and it sounded like, you know, cannons going off. That's what was happening there. I mean, it was actually in the ocean, of course, part of it. So you have this steam that generates these huge explosions. It's a very noisy volcano, which again fits the tumultuous noises description that you find in the Book of Mormon. This is the picture of the Tuxtla San Martin volcano. The other thing I looked at is we had this 1793 eruption of the San Martin volcano. So the question was, okay, can this volcano, can you generate ash sufficient, which if we're looking at the mist of darkness being the ash cloud, can you cover the land northward and southward? So there was actually a Spanish naturalist that came over after the eruption and documented, went around to the different cities and documented basically by interview and others where the ash cloud was stifling or, you know, they couldn't see very well. And so these cities he actually looked at. So I can say that for sure it went that far. And then there was actually a core in a marsh area, which also had a layer of ash up in this area here from this eruption. You know, it may have gone further. And again, this is just mapping it in. If you have a different, you know, winds, and the Tehuantepec winds run right through here and are very powerful, you could have had, I'm not saying this is the extent of the ash that could have occurred. It was just what happened in that eruption. So it actually works seems like that's the best candidate for the volcano eruption. And as we look along here, it's showing where the volcano sits on the fault. It's actually, and it shows you the zone level of 8 damage, meaning, so you're going to have with this fault system moving, and who knew, you know, which fault portion of the fault moved most or least, I don't know that, but at least you could say anything within this area is just from the earthquake alone on the regional fault system is going to be sufficient to collapse cities. Now we talked about the liquefaction, so we know that further away from the fault, depending on the soil type, you can have this level of destruction that's going to be outside of this zone, because you may have soils and things that are that collapse and that kind of thing. Now there wasn't really a liquefaction map, so I created my own, mapped it all in based on soil types and geology types. And basically what you have is in these areas, you'll have a factor of 2.4, meaning it'll double, more than double the intensity of the earthquake in those areas, the effective, you know, shaking or whatever because of the liquefaction. Here a little, you know, 1.6 and 1.8. One of the interesting things that, and so at this point, you know, again, part of the goal is to say, okay, the Sorensen model has certain cities identified. Do those, the description of what happened in those cities match? And Bountiful actually matches pretty well. It's technically outside of the, it's over here, so it's technically outside of the, just outside of what you call the zone where you'd have the destruction. So it wasn't necessarily subject to being destroyed, which it wasn't. But the recounting is that they could see the destruction that was adjacent. I mean, it was some period of time later, almost a year later. And as you can see, you have this area that's super susceptible to liquefaction, where you would have had a lot of destruction right across the river. And Sorensen had it as Tonala, I think is the name of the city where he had Bountiful. So that's actually a very good fit, because it sits, Bountiful, Tonala sits right on the more or less bedrock, if you will. Then just across, there was, if in fact that's the location, you would have had a lot of destruction just very adjacent to it. Okay, so I kind of, summary to this point, the best fit for all of these events and the general locations is you have the darkness and vapor, volcanic ash and volcanic gas, great quakings and tremblings, a regional earthquake and aftershocks, terrible thunderings and whirlwinds from the volcanic eruption, dreadful groanings, a regional earthquake and aftershocks, great storm, tempest, volcano, face of land changed, sinking, volcanic eruption, and regional earthquake. So you don't really need a hurricane, as I mentioned, all the effects you can get just from a regional earthquake and a volcano. So then we're going to actually the specific cities where Sorensen had, and see whether they actually would make sense with what we know now. Again, we're taking the geologic parameters and laying them into Sorensen's model to see if it fits. So what you would have to have, we have the earth was carried up, and in the place of the city there became a great mountain. What can that mean, really? Again, they're describing it in their own terms. It's ancient peoples. So they're, they don't know about faults and all that, subduction zones or anything. So they're just describing what they saw. So we're looking for an earthquake triggered landslide. Probably you're looking at a Mercalli 8 intensity above. Is there any area? And Sorensen kind of had Moroni hot, this general area. He wasn't quite sure, because he said, well, it's probably the place where they were doing, he was battling, he was a military figure in the Book of Mormon. And actually there is a location that works really well for that. It's the 2007, we had a 2007 Grijalva River landslide where you had a big slide. It was the largest debris event, mass movement, I think almost in history, created a large mountain right in the middle of the river. This is a plain what happens is you have the slippage, then over hundreds of years, it will erode out. This zone of slippage will occur again once the toe is gone. Those of you that may be familiar with Utah, we had what's called the Thistle Slide of Spanish Fork Canyon. And that was part of the problem. They started trying to take the toe off, and it starts slipping more and more because when you take that away. And it's a zone where you have historical slippage. So it's a good location. It's a plausible location where you could have had that occur. You could also have the Great Mountain from debris flow from the volcano. There's a lot of possibilities there, but at least I'm saying that the Sorensen model works for the city of Moroni and the area that he has. Gilgal, we don't really know. And part of what this exercise is actually helping to identify where these cities might have been. Sorensen doesn't have Gilgal in his model really, but I can say that based on the description of it being sunk and covered with earth, you're probably looking at this area, perhaps out in your liquefaction areas, but that's a good place. So we further identified where Gilgal, which nobody would know exactly where it was. You also have the cities destroyed, Jacob, Ugath, Laman, Josh, Gad, Kishkumen, where it said that they send down fire to destroy them. I kind of took the Krakatoa eruption where there were reports of, how far distance from the volcano you had ignition and people being burned. And so I kind of indicated that these would be the areas. Again, I'm not saying it's Pico de Orizaba, but if that was involved, that this would be the area where you would expect to find those cities based on the description of their destruction. It is possible that you could maybe interpret that as lightning, where it says send down fire to destroy them, but I think that doesn't really fit that well. I think that basically the volcanic explanation seems to fit that language better. You have the cities of Gadiandi, Gadiamna, Jacob, and Jim, however you want to pronounce that. Maybe Brian can correct me there. But you had sunk and made hills and valleys in the places thereof. The inhabitants were being buried up in the depths of the earth. This requires that they be within proximity to the fault to account for the subsidence, meaning that sunk. The interesting thing is the hills, where it said there were hills and valleys in the place thereof. It's not really, you have earthquake cracking and some movement, but it's not really, you don't have huge valleys or hills typically. But what is interesting is actually in the Mount St. Helens eruption, there was a feature that they observed after the pyroclastic flow was actually, which they hadn't really noted before, geologists hadn't noted it before, was you have these hill and valley hummocky features that form after there's a deposition of the pyroclastic material. So it actually is a pretty good description of that that they would have observed each. 3 cities, I can't really tell exactly where they are, but at least you can limit where you're looking for them, that they've got to be in an area where hydrology has been modified, either blocking of a river, rapid inundation of a water body such as a lake. Doesn't seem to contemplate a rise in the ocean. It's as the sea is specifically mentioned, and with Moroni, you'd expect maybe they would have mentioned it if it was, seaside cities. Sorensen identifies that Jerusalem is like Atitlan, and that's not a bad fit. It's in south. It has Jerusalem down there, and this is by basically a caldera. So, and there's a city down there called Samabaj. It's 60 meters currently underwater. That was a Maya kind of ceremonial city or site, and that could be a plausible location for it. City of Moroni, as we mentioned, it was along the sea. Sinking was involved, so it wasn't just a flood event. It would need to be in a zone of earthquake subsidence or liquefaction. You could have flooding possibilities like a tsunami, meaning it had to sink, so it would have to basically erode. There'd have to be some sort of erosion event for a physical sinking in the city. Sorensen has it over here, Moroni along the coast here, and it's outside of the level 8 area, but it's actually within the, it's in that soil liquefaction area that I identified in that previous map. So it actually does have a decent fit to what Sorensen has. And there are historical examples of this very thing happening. The city of Port Royal, Jamaica, sunk into the ocean due to liquefaction caused by an earthquake in 1692. And it matches in other ways too. It was a pirate city. And so when it was destroyed, they just said, well, it's because they're wicked. That's why. So kind of actually matches the Book of Mormon narrative. Then you could also, like I mentioned, you may have had a tsunami or large wave come through, which would actually change your elevation. This was a Hurricane Isabel damage where you had this left side is your beach barrier island, and then it just kind of wiped it out and lowered the elevation. It doesn't look to be I do think that the liquefaction matches the description better of it being sunk, but you could technically, this might actually also be a possibility. The city of Zarahemla did take fire, which could have come from earthquake-induced upset, meaning you had fires, you had interior, flame for lighting. Could be also a possibility of lightning. It's been pointed out prior discussions that, well, you have 3 hours of the great storm, then you didn't have capability of lighting fire. So if it took fire, it may have to have done that in the first, the damage in the first 3 hours. Although, the description of the mist of darkness covering everything, of course, it's based on observation of people reporting to probably Nephi as the prophet at the time. So it doesn't mean that every mountaintop was covered or whatever. You have to kind of take it under consideration of the description, the information that they had being reported. One thing is, I didn't have it in the book, but there's actually some interesting linguistic correlations that you find with the city of Josh, which was destroyed by fire. In one of the etymologies, the Hebrew etymologies of Josh is derived from fire. So I use Sumerian and Mokum. You have moos to crush. Chuum is the place or discharge water. Jimno, interestingly enough, you have to kill, storm, clay mud. In Egyptian, you have Jim to smash, tear, break up. Again, my pronunciation is just phonetic English, so Brian can correct me there. But the composite meaning is to kill with a storm, clay with clay and mud, noise, stone, and paste. So it does match the description. And Gadiamna, similar, swift flood, noise, corpses, shining powers, stone weight, paste, earth piles. So I do think the names are actually describing kind of what happened wise, at least some of the cities. Okay, so that kind of handles the third Nephi event. There are a couple other geological events that occurred in the Book of Mormon, call them the prison events. You have the land of Nephi, prison volcano. The description is you first have an earthquake, you have an overshadowing cloud of darkness, second earthquake, third earthquake, cloud of darkness dissipated. The prison discussion, or the discussion of what happened with the prison, is a Mercalli level 4 or 5. Sorensen has it down in Guatemala City. I actually used the Zobin equation because now I had actually kind of the level, I had to back calculate and say you have a level of intensity and see whether that level of intensity of shaking corresponded with a volcano, because you had this cloud coming down within the proximate area. And in fact, you have Picaya that matches almost exactly what you would expect. The prison where Sorensen had the prison, that matched very well. Because he has land of Nephi, is Guatemala City area. Camino al Juyu is the ancient ruins. Then I looked at the Ammonihah event, which is peculiar in that there was this great noise that's discussed where they all ran out. It's actually a known product of an earthquake, but it's called an earthquake boom, and they're called super shear earthquakes, where it moves sufficient to break this sound barrier, creates a sonic boom. But it only occurs in certain situations, typically strike slip fault. Usually you're needing a granite of some sort underlying it. So it's kind of like, okay, let's see if that works before Sorensen has it. Sorensen has the city of Ammonihah as Mirador. Don't confuse that with El Mirador that's in the Yucatan. This is up in Chiapas. This is an archaeological site. And it's right along, you have a strike slip fault right here, just as you would need for an earthquake boom. The underlying, the geologic map, meaning this purple is actually underlying. These are layers of formations, and the purple actually underlies the whole area. And so you have an earthquake in the metagranite, which is exactly what you have, all the parameters needed for a super shear earthquake. So what has kind of been accomplished by this effort? Again, I was trying to give reasonable explanation for all of the events described in the Book of Mormon geological events. Everything from great mound to tumultuous noises are all possible and feasible. One thing I didn't talk about in the book is also you have the one geological event where you have Lehi when he first left Jerusalem. You had the pillar of fire that was out of a rock. And so basically when he left, it's been surmised that evidence is that he visited lands of his inheritance, which is from Manasseh. So up in this area is where he went. And there's actually a volcanic field, a cinder cone field that is active, that occurs. It's kind of, I didn't overlay it, but you have the Sea of Galilee up here. And so you can kind of see that this area of Manasseh did have the volcanic activity, and maybe down in a little bit in here. So again, it matches, this isn't really a Sorensen model, but it matches what this Book of Mormon says, where you might have expected volcanic, basically fire coming out of a volcanic vent or rock. So anyway, this is just kind of a summary that we at least have a better idea of where some of these cities were geographically, and that anybody that develops a model has to account and, has these cities, will need to look at them and make sure they meet their criteria. So and again, this is just kind of a summary of the things that you need to look for. Did look at whether you could have multiple volcanic eruptions at the same time. That's possible. It doesn't happen very often. The Kamchatka Peninsula has that happen. So I kind of have one volcano. You don't need more than one volcano, honestly, to have what happens in the Book of Mormon. But there could have been more than one erupting. This wasn't so much in the book, but I've had questions on the Heartland model. Of course, there's really the Heartland. There isn't like Sorensen, where there's like a very specific map. There's a lot of different people have different maps. I went to some of the, I've attended the Firm Foundation conferences with some regularity, trying to collect maps as part of it. And so there are various maps, but this is kind of one that considers, I'd say this is probably the predominant map. The problem you have when you're applying the geologic parameters to the Heartland model is, again, you don't have a volcano. So then you have to say, okay, if I don't have a volcano, I have to have hazards generated that described in the Book of Mormon with the listed effects. So you have like local storms and tornadoes. Like I said, a hurricane's not going to work because you have a 3-hour storm. You're going to have longer than that. The seasonality doesn't work really either. So there are some difficulties. You do have an earthquake possibility along the New Madrid Fault, but we'll talk about that. One of the primary problems is the vapor, mist, and darkness. Basically, you have anecdotal, if you watch the videos, the Meldrum videos, there's some anecdotal reports of the earthquakes on the New Madrid in the 1800s, but those are all local effects. There was what's called earthquake smog, which is basically just, it only occurs when you have saturated soil along the fault, typically a river basin, and you get condensate that comes up like a fog, but it's only local, and it doesn't, it's very short duration. You have the sand blows, which were talked about in the prior, some discussion. Those do happen, and they do push sand into the air, but again, they're very proximate and fairly close to the fault system, and generally they're only occurring as you have the major, either the earthquake or the major aftershocks, and so it doesn't spout sand the whole time, it just shoots up the sand at a time. So talked about the earthquake fog. Also, you have to have vapor that's hazardous, has to be hazardous enough to overpower people. Has been mentioned previously. There are some gases come off of earthquakes, carbon dioxide, but again, they're very proximate to the fault. There's actually not been any documented deaths from overcoming by gas unless the area has volcanic activity or is underlain by volcanic activity, which produces like high levels of gas. So it's not, although it kind of sounds good, it's not ever been documented. Sounds good in the sense that, well, you think that might happen, but again, the attempt here is to actually say, okay, you have these people's ideas, how does it actually work? Well, from what we know of the science. The biggest problem, I think, with almost all the Heartland models is they're way too big, and they have the land northward up here. Most of them that I've seen. That's where all of your destruction had to take place. The New Badger Fault, and these are your, this is the, from the USGS, this is the area where you would have, this is the shaking. And again, your red or orange and your browns, that's the area where you have sufficient intensity where you could actually destroy buildings. As you move farther away, it doesn't have the intensity. It's been mentioned, well, you had a bell that rang up in Boston, whatever, and yes, those are way down in the Mercalli too. And it's not, actually, it doesn't take very much to ring a bell if you have small surface waves, because it only has to, it's just a pendulum effect. It's not pushing very much. So that's the problem is with the model. So in order to fit the geologic parameters, they're going to have to collapse their model to be much smaller somehow. I don't know how you're going to do that with narrow neck and all the other geographic parameters. So, but again, that's I'm not, I'm just trying to indicate what the geologic parameters are. And then, as Paul mentioned, I have some other books that are all free on my website, bmslr.org. And anyway, I think I finished close to on time, Paul. I guess it's 8 o'clock. So if anybody has any questions.
Well, thank you, Jerry. I do have questions. Let me lead out with one simple one that I think nobody else would ask. And that is, I saw that you had the Tehuantepec Ridge. It was in the Pacific, and I presume it just simply must be underwater and not one that we can see along the Isthmus of Tehuantepec.
Yeah, that's which map was that one?
Because my experience along the Isthmus of Tehuantepec would not identify it with a ridge. The Coatzacoalcos River bisects it. And by the way, I wanted to point out that when Frank and I were there, we took some pictures. And as I look back at it, one of the pictures that I spent an hour looking for this afternoon and did not find, probably Frank has it, but one of the pictures does show layering along the bank of the Coatzacoalcos River, suggesting a very significant ash deposit layer, probably from the volcano that you're talking about.
Yeah, in fact, there's actually a stela at Tres Zapotes that I think is dated to 31 BC that has covered with ash. So we know there was a post, again, your carbon dating only gets you a certain parameter, certain basically range of dates. So let's see, where are we talking about? The trench or let's see.
I was talking there to you, Tehuantepec Ridge.
Which map was that on?
I think the TR is probably, the TR is marking it there.
Are you here? Is this where we were at, or?
I think the TR is probably marking that ridge, but it appears to be a split underwater, I'm guessing.
Yeah, here's the trench, meaning this is where the plate's going underneath. There may be a ridge here along, sometimes it pushes up a little bit, but that would be underwater. So, this is your topography. So you're right. I mean, the river, again, in my looking at it, I call it the line Bountiful, with River Bountiful, which runs like right here, the river you're talking about. So you do have this little high ridge here, which looks like this, the small neck, the Chivalas Pass, and then you drop down to this side. So that's your narrow neck. And one of the things that people always talk about is, well, that's too wide for a day and a half, but passage of a Nephite, but actually it says along the line Bountiful, which is a river, and you can go faster along a river. So it's not really a problem once you understand that language in the Book of Mormon, because a river in Egyptian is a line. Other directionals have it as a line in the hieroglyphs. So, and it's a boundary river. They have it as a line. So your river Sidon isn't called a line, but you have a line here. You also have the line of Lamanite possessions, which the Usimacinta runs here. So that matches very well. You have two boundary rivers that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon as lines. Anyway, that's not related here.
Yeah, let me recommend to people go to the reactions, and you can raise your hand in the reactions and be recognized in sequence that way. But wow, thank you so much for the remarkable education you provided us in the past hour. Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, David DeBarth and then Frank Fry. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Jerry. Great presentation. Wonderful research. I really appreciate your efforts there. I have a question. As a training in earth science that's bugged me for many years. The Mesoamerican area lies right in the Ring of Fire, and it's continuously having earthquakes and volcanoes. For example, I just checked, in the past 7 days, there have been 32 earthquakes in Panama, 3 of those M3 plus. So the place, it's extremely active geologically. And yet the Book of Mormon only has 1 event.
Well, it has, like I said, it has the prison events. But one thing about it is that's one thing I think I've shown is that when they talked about that this was something that had never happened before, it was because it was a simultaneous volcanic eruption and an earthquake. So they do talk about quakings, and then the prison events. Again, I think they're really only looking at these things in the context of something of religious significance. So if you kind of get what I'm saying, I mean, the Book of Mormon is not a history of anything, really. It's basically has some lineage histories in it, but it's mostly concentrating on the religious message. And so the geography is just sufficiently described to couch the religious messages within it, or the religious stories in it. So when people say, yeah, that's history, it's like, no, I've never looked at the Book of Mormon as some history text. And so
Okay, I
there was a lot
understand
of
that. Appreciate that. I can't believe that there was just one catastrophic event during the history of the Book of Mormon in that area. It's just too geologically active.
Well, I think along the Veracruz Fault, and actually there are a lot of earthquakes, a lot of them are at depth. The Veracruz Fault doesn't erupt quite as often. And like I say, there may have been other events, but they didn't involve the eruption of a volcano and this huge, large earthquake. And it was a strike slip. The subduction zone typically is not a strike slip. So yeah, it's seismically active. You do have some large earthquakes. But I do think this was actually, must have, and just like you said, they had some of these things happening. So it must have been a very large event, and also concurring, a volcanic eruption occurring at the same time, tells you it was a large event.
Thank you. Okay, Frank.
Chris.
Yes. Thank you very, very much, Jerry. That was a wonderful presentation. And there's a lot of things that correlate with what I've researched out. My first experience in Mexico was in 1965. We went as far as Oaxaca down there, but did a lot of traveling after Paul and I were there. Paul and I were there in 67, and we did travel quite a ways on that trip, but later on in the 80s and the 90s, I had the opportunity to travel with a professor he was an engineering professor from Lincoln, Nebraska, and he had several small planes at his disposal during a number of years, and we flew down over that. He called me after one of our tours that he attended and wanted to know if I would fly with him into Mexico and be his interpreter and guide down there. And we flew all the way to the Guatemalan border, everywhere from the Pacific to the Caribbean to the Gulf, everywhere. And then one time I had the opportunity to drive the same road, following from the Pacific to the Caribbean to Belize, within about 2 weeks after I'd flown over the top of it. And we really did. I got a lot of photographs and video and stuff from those trips. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, have you looked at any of Garth Norman's geography? Because it fits better with what I probably believe that Paul and I would be on the same page as Garth Norman is. Vernil Simmons and Shirley Heater and Eric Turner are all on the same page. And Eric has an enormous website with a very good map on it. I can get that for you guys if you want sometime.
Yeah, I did actually have a chapter in the book. I didn't really talk about it here. I only had limited time.
Okay.
But the problem you run into, what they have is, and Richard Houck, he has over in this neck of the woods too. And
Right.
Norman, the problem that you have when you're moving is a lot of them try to use the Usumacinta or others, and they push these eastern cities over on this side, and Ammonihah ends up somewhere over here. So you end up with areas, the Yucatan is extremely stable geologically. Yes, you have the fault down here, but there really have nothing occurred along here. So you run into difficulty trying to explain the Ammonihah event, because if you lay out the geography, Ammonihah has to be basically west of northwest, or, you know, to that extent of Zarahemla, right? And so you have, you know, the Usumacinta, somehow you have to
Well, there's a number of problems. A number of problems with that also. The Tuxtla Mountains is where Sorensen has his Hill Cumorah. And that's nothing but a pure volcanic caldera over there. The whole area, in your map right there, though, that whole area is just filled with volcanoes. And there's a huge lake up there that's in the middle of a volcanic crater, Catemaco.
Yeah, the plug though, the Hill Cumorah plug is a volcanic plug that has not been active for tens of thousands of years. So it's not part of it. It's actually historic volcano, but the activity doesn't occur. So it's actually it's not erupted or anything. So,
well, the problem is with that too is there's no place for a narrow passage that leads into the land northward, and the fact that the Hill Cumorah has got to have at a place where there's lots of caves. The cave system that we're looking at is in a limestone mountain range that does have thousands of caves in it. And some of the largest caves in the world have been found there just within the last 30 years or so. Also,
well, again, you know, part of that, I'm not going to get into the, like, again, this is just to look at the
sure. I'm not being real critical of your talk. I think that you need to look farther south. Maybe we can get together and talk sometime.
Yeah, I mean, as far as narrow pass, you have this. There's also Sorensen argues the ridge here, the gravel ridge, is one of the narrow. So, but yeah, and then again, I'm not saying it's not the whole model of talking about every element. It's just saying from a geologic standpoint, if you have to take these parameters and apply them on the ground and make sure that they work. That's all I'm saying. And the Sorensen, at least from the geologic standpoint, works. Now there may be other issues people haven't that, you know, could be discussed, but.
Well, you're talking about a great geologic event that took place at the time of the crucifixion of Christ. There was a great earthquake that took place in Jerusalem. And we've always felt that that was a similar event that took place at the same time. So I think we need to be looking at something that is a lot more pervasive than just some local volcanic action here. I think probably something happened that many of these volcanoes popped at the same time. And you've got down at the bottom, put your cursor at the bottom of Belize over there next to the ocean. Right there is a city that is buried in the Caribbean. That one is sunk in there. Besides the cities over at Atitlan, there's another buried city in Lake Managua in Nicaragua.
I did look at the city over here, and basically it's a little too late, and also
it's down. No, it's not there. It's down right in the corner.
Yeah,
right. Keep going south.
Keep going south. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a salt. It was basically a manufactured salt, and its inundation was over time, meaning it was as the sea level rose over time. So again, you can look at that in the book. I talk about that. So again, it's you know, you have to actually look what is happening at this site. What's the archaeological You know, what does the
Okay.
archaeology and the geology say? So that was the problem along here. You just don't, and it's very stable. You don't have any even tsunami events that, you know, have occurred there based on the deposits or anything. So,
Check out Eric Turner's information. He's got tsunami and hurricane events that he's recorded also. Wanted to make one more comment about Manasseh. Manasseh had one area to the north of Israel, but he also had a small inheritance area right adjacent to Jerusalem. And it's very likely that Lehi's inheritance was right there at Jerusalem, because they talked about Jerusalem all the time anyway.
yeah, but I'm just saying that parameter with what's the if that's the land of inheritance, that works. Or
I'm talking about Jerusalem over in the other land, not here.
Oh, yeah, no, and I'm just saying that if you're looking at geologic parameters, if you're trying to explain
No,
that with
no,
geologic parameter,
no.
it doesn't work.
You said something about Manasseh, excuse me, Lehi's land of inheritance might have been up in the north part where Manasseh's inheritance was. I'm just commenting that there was another inheritance that Manasseh had that's right adjacent to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and I'm saying
And that's
that
more
would,
likely where he was.
well, I'm just saying from a geologic standpoint, it wouldn't fit. But if you don't, you know, if you're kind of
Well,
just saying it's a supernatural event.
If you're saying that it was that the flame that Lehi saw was a natural event, then I disagree with that. I don't think it was natural at all.
Yeah, right. And that's what I'm saying.
Sure.
These are all based on, if you were from a scientific standpoint, if you're looking at them saying these are explained by natural events, then that's,
Yeah.
you know, if you don't believe any of the things, or, you know, if it's just happened, and
Right. Yeah.
then, you know, there's probably no bother
Agreed.
to read the book. So,
Thank you. Anyway, that was great presentation.
Monty is next, and then James Lucas. Go ahead, Monty.
Okay, I don't get too worried about the fact that a lot of the tectonic and volcanic activity wasn't reported in the Book of Mormon, because it says right in the very beginning it's an abridgment of, you know, having to do with man's dealings with God. And frankly, about every time we tell ourselves and the people around us that this couldn't happen because it's impossible, the Lord just goes and does it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I was saying, that they do note it if it's in conjunction with a religious event.
you know, like the prison destruction, Alma and Amulet, prison walls falling, and the other land of. So what I'm saying, what I'm saying is you would not expect to have everything reported in the Book of Mormon that happened if it wasn't related to a religious story or event. So,
Okay, were you done, Monty?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I
James
also appreciate
Lucas.
the presentation.
Yeah, just a quick question. You had mentioned that dating historical volcanoes is somewhat imprecise, but nonetheless, 2,000 years ago isn't that long ago. So you're proposing San Martin as your prime candidate. Do we have any records of, I mean, has anybody done samples, drills, or anything to figure out historical activity of that volcano?
yeah, in fact, that was one of my slides, or is like I looked at all of them, so I only included as candidates those that had data that showed eruptions during the proper time frame. So San Martin did, as did excuse me.
Popocatépetl.
Yeah, and Pico de Orizaba. El Chicon had one, and then there were some further
Chichon.
south. El Chicon, sorry, and then there were some further south. There wasn't very good data down in those Guatemala chain.
So within the parameters of what you can show from the scientific evidence, what is the time frame of the San Martin volcano that, I mean, are we 50 years? Is it 20 years?
Oh, I
Around that
think
20?
I'd have to get my book out. I think
Okay,
it's
sorry.
Yeah, it's dovetailed within like 100, 150 years, something like that's typical for the range in radiometric dating. So,
Oh,
but
okay.
again,
So so it's 100 years is kind of the rough time range that,
Well, yeah, it depends on, some samples, and the radiometric dating curve, it depends on when you're looking at. But you can't even get more accurate than that. There are some that have wider ranges, that maybe 250 years. So I looked at all of and I actually list those in the book, saying here are all the documented eruptions and the dating, the radiometric dating ranges. And there may have been multiple eruptions in that range.
okay. All right, thank you. That was my
So
question.
yeah, it's basically a cut saying, these are all the ones that potentially it could be. And then if looking at all the, again, the best fit, most plausible. It's possible, other things are possible, but I'm just saying that's the data. What's the data is, it can only get you so far.
Okay, so if you would have to be cautious about presenting this as proof of the Book of Mormon, because subject could come back and say, well, you're talking about a time range of 100 years. That's not very precise from a historical dating point of view. I mean, that's just an issue that you'd have to say, you'd have to admit to.
Yeah, the purpose of this exercise was to actually say all of the events can be scientifically explained, geological events in the Book of Mormon. So that was basically part of this. I mean, there's nothing there that's outside of possibility from a geologic standpoint. The second thing you look at is, okay, there are certain things that you have to, and this isn't so much, I've never cared about proving the Book of Mormon to anybody, to be honest with you, in all my research. It's just, but I'm saying if you're proposing a geographic model, people have never really considered the geologic parameters. Just like you were mentioning, there may be other things that you don't think fit, but if your model cannot meet the geologic parameters, you can't figure out that, then that's a problem with your model. So you may need to modify your model, abandon the model. Like Baja California, for example, doesn't have a volcano that erupted, the most recent eruption 1,000 years ago. So that model has that problem. So they try to explain it, well, there was this big fog bank that occurred and this big hurricane came through, but then you have problems with, well, you don't have fog and then all of a sudden immediately quiescent meteorology. I mean, you don't have this great storm and then it all of a sudden goes to nothing and then fogs. I mean, again, you have to look at these parameters and see whether they work or not. The Sorensen model seems to work. Now, there may be arguments as to, well, the Hill Cumorah location, maybe there's not caves or something like that. I get that, but from a geologic standpoint, it does actually work. There may be other models that work too.
Okay, thank you. That's my question.
Okay, Ed, then Rick. Go ahead, Ed. Oops.
Got to unmute.
How about now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, Jerry. If I were presenting a case before a trier of fact as an attorney, I would have to say that given your analysis, the heartland theory is debunked. Would you agree?
Well, I've been an expert witness in court before, so I've been asked a lot of questions by attorneys, but what I'm saying is there may be a model that would work. It's just the new Madrid fault has problems with the size that they have. They also have the land northward problem. You have all this destruction of the land northward.
Well,
how did it occur? And so the current models I see don't work. Could they modify it and change it and shrink it? I don't possibly, I don't know.
well, the biggest problem they've got is there's no volcano.
Well, right. That becomes the problem, is how do you explain that event, the mists of darkness without a volcano? Basically, what Meldrum has put out was there was earthquake fog, which that did happen, but it's a condensate that occurs only along the local fault where you have basically saturated soil and you have condensation that arises, because of
So
the earthquake. So,
that's the,
so what they're describing are things that say, well, this is what works. But again, when you put it on the ground and use those parameters, you have to get specific. That's why a lot of people propose models. It's
yeah,
kind of like, Mark Twain went through Nevada and he said, everybody has a mining claim. The poor people have a lot of them. So it's kind of like a lot of people propose models, but unless you get specific and actually say this has to occur here, that's when they start to fall apart and become more difficult. Not just from a geologic standpoint, from a do you have the archaeological support for cities in these locations? Do you writing, all these other factors have to be looked at. So this is just one parameter to look at. And I've had some others argue basically Mesoamerica, these other Mesoamerican, I just did their presentation and they got angry because they said, we like everything, but we don't like that part of it. I said, well, if you can explain it geologically some other way, I'm fine. I'm just saying that's you have to look at the geology is something that doesn't really change over time, meaning it's kind of what was there 2,000 years ago in terms of fault systems and volcanoes.
well, I'll be honest with you. I've always had a problem with the fact that the heartland theory, I mean, I grew up in Iowa, in Lamoni. I know there's no volcanoes.
Right.
You can't just ignore that. And I've always wondered, how in the world would you be able to explain?
And I think that's what I'm saying. They have some explanations, kind of some anecdotal, and that's fine. But when you actually take those explanations and try to lay them into, they're still just local effects along the fault. They're not expansive over, because they have a very large area that they believe the Book of Mormon took place over most of them. You have, Lamanites down Gulf of Mexico, and then you have Narrow Neck somewhere up at the Great Lakes, and to the north is your land of desolation. And when it's so large, you have a difficulty having these, effects that affected basically all the land northward and all the land south.
Well, it's comforting to claim the lands of the Book of Mormon for the national borders of the United States. But one of the arguments that the firm people made was, given the number of years they were present, 400 years or so, that the Mesoamerican land was too small to enclose the population that would have developed. I don't know. Have you considered that?
Well, it's not part of my book, but the new LiDAR that they've got down there shows tens of millions of people inhabiting that area. It's up to 20. And so, not all Book of Mormon per se, but there were large populations down there. And, the Book of Mormon population, other than the Jaredites and the final battle, and even those numbers you have to take with a grain of salt, because they may, typically were symbolic. And the last battle talks about the men, women, and children. So maybe it's your total population got wiped out. It may not, and especially for most of Book of Mormon time, they may not have been that large of a population. In fact, the other book where I did translate the characters document, it just one of the sections is that it was like 20,000 people was the migration from Mosiah to Zarahemla. So then there were people in Zarahemla like twice as many. So you're 60,000 maybe at that point in time. Prior to that, they had lots of wars and where we don't have a lot of history in the small plates. So it's hard to say. So you're not necessarily looking at large populations until later on. The Jaredites, of course, the Olmec talks about millions, but again, you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt, because he's talking about over the entire battles. It's not just the last battle where this Corianumr is referring to. And there were a lot of Olmec. There's a lot of population down there at that time. So I don't really see the population issue as a big problem.
Well, your investigation seemed to me to put the heartland theory on very troubled waters. I mean,
Agreed.
still got the Hill Cumorah problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't, honestly, I am very friendly and nice to all Heartland. To me, like some people have said here on these meetings, to me, it's not the most critical thing, obviously. It helps you understand the Book of Mormon, I think, if you kind of know generally where it took place and the culture in which it's embedded, whether you're looking at, just like Frank did, the black skin issue, those kinds of things can give you some explanations that you wouldn't otherwise have unless you know the location. But the key is it is historical. That's what I most worry about. Is people say it didn't take place anywhere, and then people propose places that don't really work. Then it just adds more fodder, to the people arguing it's not historical at all, which it is.
Well, but that's really the point. Facts matter. If it doesn't work, then the model may just be wrong.
Yeah, and again, like I say, it's if people want to. Again, I have people calling me. I want you to do geologic. I mean, they don't really understand. This book took me 2.5 years of research to go through every single volcano in Central America, looking at all of the sampling that's been. I mean, it was quite voluminous. So a lot of the Heartland people say, "We need you." I'm like, I don't have. I've kind of written the template. Now you take it and go try to apply the geology to your own model and see if it works. If it does, great. Or you have a definite explanation, it's great. But that as I did this, it was pretty clear to me that the Sorensen model does work. The Siemens-Sinton model had some problems because it shifts cities into areas that are not seismically active that have to be seismically active. It has all the eastern cities piled up on the east side of the Yucatan, which is very stable geologically. So it just has problems. Garth's had, most everybody has the land northward up in the Olmec, where Sorensen does. It just, those models tend to have differentiation in the land southward and lines, how that was divvied up or divided. That's one reason I did the book on the land northward, the Swords of Shul, because most of the people in Mesoamerican research kind of recognize the Olmec Jaredite correlation. So.
Well, seems to me, as someone who practiced law for 50 years, and if you find an important fact that your opponent's theory depends on, and you can demonstrate that it doesn't exist, they're done and you're done.
Yeah, of course, I don't really have opponents. I just do research and publish it. So I don't have any.
Yeah,
I mean, for me, they're all good people. Everybody's trying to do the best they can, and and I think my research. Honestly, when I first wrote this book, I hadn't done all this other research on characters document or anything. The geology was the first research I did. And so, but as I looked, like I said, the characters document has a Mesoamerican number 9 in it. That's kind of, indicative of that. Probably that's another clue where it took place. And, Frank's presentation on, the skin of blackness, those kinds of, there's just certain things that actually make sense down there. And, you can talk about, like Frank did, as well as Hill Cumorah here. Those are valid arguments people can make, but I do think it's pretty clear it took place in Mesoamerica, and there are pretty strong correlations. Geology is just one.
Just one, but wow, it's pretty hard to get over that. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, Rick, and then Frank. Go ahead, Rick.
Okay. Hey, thanks, Jerry, for your presentation. It's an enormous amount of work that you gave in 1 hour.
Sorry about that.
No, I any more information, I would have been overloaded with the science.
The book is free, so you can download it
Yeah.
and look at it as you want.
Yeah. I did teach earth science, and I love the plate tectonics and the different subduction zones and things like that, and the different kind of volcanoes you get at each area. The question I was wanting to ask, you know, in the Book of Mormon, it says in the RLDS 4:6 and LDS 8:5, it says it was the worst storm that had ever, there arose a great storm, such and one has never been known in all the land. So it didn't say they didn't have any storms. It's just said this one was the worst to date.
Yeah.
So
And I did, in the book, I talk about where there was actually diminished, there wasn't that much volcanic activity, at least from the volcanoes that I looked at prior. So, and that's also one of the parameters when you have like these faults. When you have a volcano and a fault erupting at the same time, it's because the volcano's primered, because it's actually built up pressure and, you know, it's got just a buildup. So yeah, I actually kind of showed that in the book, where I showed that they're actually, they may not have seen that many volcanic eruptions, large ones. And also they have to be in areas of the population, right? Because they kill people. So you can have, there could have been a volcano erupt further down Costa Rica or something, but it wasn't in their area.
yeah. Another phrase I didn't realize, but when Lehi and the people are crossing the ocean, it's when they you know, became rude and were dancing and talking. He says a great storm arose and a terrible tempest. So those same kind of phraseologies are used both there at the ocean event, and then this event at the death of Jesus. And this, another thing that puzzled me was in the same the same book, 3rd Nephi, LDS 8:16, RLDS 4:13, it says that the whirlwind carried away people.
Right.
Is there, you know, I know there's the natural model to explain something, there's supernatural model to explain something, and then there may be a combination of, you know, natural elements and supernatural control of those elements. You know, like the flood, for instance. So in your hypothesis or your theory, what was it that would be strong enough to carry away people in a whirlwind?
Well, like I mentioned, the pyroclastic event maybe could even be described as a whirlwind. It's just, and you have this huge amounts of, you know, superheated. There have been tornadoes observed in Mesoamerica. They're not very common, and I showed you the pictures of the whirlwinds that occur. That was just immediately after the pyroclastic flow went through. So you had superheated air that was, you know, it was carried away in the whirlwind. Well, those people would have been fried before the whirlwind.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
and you know, it's kind of hard. I mean, so yes, I mean, I think you can, that explanation, that language would fall within what you could be described in a volcanic eruption, or after, you know, winds or whirlwinds afterward, in the wake of the immediate eruption anyway.
Yeah, I don't have to have, you know, like a natural explanation for all the supernatural events that happen. You know, I believe the Book of Mormon, you know, before I probably knew Central America existed, or the other things. So I appreciate your time and your research and sharing it with us.
Yeah, and again, like I say, I'm not, this isn't, people can believe a lot of this and they won't have a testimony of the Book of Mormon. It's actually a spiritual confirmation that occurs. So
yeah,
but this is basically saying, if you take the premise that all these things that happen have some natural or some other way of explaining it, you know, then that is helpful. Even like Sodom and Gomorrah, they've recently found, you know, the city that you actually had like a Tumbaga, or not Tumbaga, the Tunguska event, and Russia that had basically an asteroid explosion occurred of, and it's right in the right location of the Dead Sea. It basically burned all the bricks and dismembered bodies, and has shock quartz and right time frame. So I do think there is a natural basis for a lot of these events.
Right.
Again, it doesn't mean God didn't have a hand. And if you know, I actually put that in the book. It said Christ caused these things. Doesn't mean he didn't have natural methods of having them destroyed. Just
Yeah.
like a lot of the destruction was by other wicked people killing them, and so it's not like God made all these people wicked just so they could kill them. It was just he knew that's what was happening, and he wasn't going to help, tell them where to go or protect them anymore. So
Yeah. Okay. I'll yield to Frank.
Thank you. Rick, I wanted to just mention, they had a tornado in Oaxaca when we were living there, so they do exist down there.
yeah, right.
Wanted to also mention a couple other things. Orizaba, over northwest of Veracruz, is the tallest volcano in North America. It is huge, and it's even taller looking because of the fact that it rises from the seacoast all the way up to around, I think it's around 18,000. Am I right? No. Yeah, around 18,000 feet or so. And it's got a perfect cone at the top of it. It looks kind of like Fujiyama. It's beautiful. Also, there was a volcanic eruption at Cuicuilco just a few years ago. I was there, and we checked the date that happened. Cuicuilco is a pre-classic, meaning before the time of Christ, ruin, and it was covered over by a volcanic lava flow, and we had checked the dating on it. I think it was something like 70 BC, which doesn't seem to fit the time frame that the Book of Mormon talks about when Christ was crucified. However, there's a plus or minus 50 years for the carbon 14, so you can see that where it could fit very possibly.
Yeah, I actually went down there and inspected the lava surface and different things.
Yeah.
Part of the issue there with it's from the Shixle volcano is it's kind of the wrong kind of volcano in the sense that it's lava. It's more, it does have a little bit of pyroclastic, but it wasn't this event that, people had time to get out.
Oh, sure. I don't,
Yeah, so,
it was
so the
abandoned.
lava flowed
Yeah.
down. Well,
Right.
and there's actually been multiple dating there. The problem they had is trying to find the exact surface.
Mhm.
Some people were dating, archaeological material that was actually below where the eruptive surface was.
Did
But
you
I do
say
actually-
you've been there?
Yeah.
You went down there. Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been all, through Mesoamerica and Teotihuacan, all those. One of the things too is I do kind of think that, and this is just conjecture, but I think that may be one of the reasons why you had this time of peace is because you had other volcanic activity in areas like, because the theory is maybe the Teotihuacanos equate to Gadianton type, so there are other areas were having problems, and so they weren't really worried about warfare. They were survival, and so you had, because there's been other volcanic eruptions a little bit later in like the 1st century AD, down further south. So there may be something to the volcanic activity that it was occurring that made it so they were able to have people coming to try to destroy them, or attack them. So again, that's just my conjecture.
Well, I personally believe that the Teotihuacan area was probably a gathering place where they did that. That may very well be where the kingdom did exist afterwards, because almost everything down there in the south had been destroyed. One of the professors at the university where Paul and I attended said that the only thing that Teotihuacan had to export was its religion. and it did it very well, and it spread it all over to the south and to the north and everywhere.
Yeah, I think the Cadiaton relationship is more, you kind of see that with what happened.
That died out
towards
before and then arose afterwards too. Yeah.
Yeah, I
But
mean, they're all down in the Maya
Sure.
with the Lamanites, and like you saw, the Gadianton robbers were combined with them, and then the final battle. So it does look like Teotihuacan influence kind of correlates with Gadianton concept.
I think it was there. Yeah. However, there was this period of peace that existed for a long time. One last thing I just wanted to mention, and you probably won't find a lot of people that believe in this, but I think that this guy has some real merit. His name is Walt Brown. He's got a PhD in physics, I believe. He taught at the university or the Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs most of his life. He was the only guy, first and probably the only guy that was sent by the Air Force to go to MIT to study and get a PhD and not worry about football or anything like that. It was a real science that he got. And in the process, later on, he became a Christian. And then he spent the rest of his life, even as he was finishing his teaching career at the Air Force Academy, looking at the Bible and the creation and the flood. And his theory is he deals with tectonic plates and stuff, but he calls his the hydroplate theory. I'd like for you to, when you have some time, just look up the name Walt Brown and look up creation, and you'll find the his website. And he's written a book, and it's on its 9th edition. The 8th edition is still live on the website, and you can read it. Actually, the 9th edition is on the website. He has not gotten it in paper yet because it's tied up in some kind of program thing that when they changed computers, they lost the ability to do some of the things they wanted to do. And so his entire 9th edition of this is on the website, and the book is called In the Beginning. And it is hundreds of pages long, and it's full color. That's one of the earlier editions. Which edition is that? That's Rick, right? You got to unmute, Rick.
I have the 9th edition that I printed out 2 nights ago.
You printed it out. My goodness. How thick is it?
Well, it's about 60 pages for one chapter.
Oh, that's just the one on the source of radioactivity.
Yes.
Yeah, I mentioned that to you. Yeah.
This is the first edition.
That's the first edition. I think I have one of those too. I've got 3 editions of his. And the latest one that I have is the 8th edition, and it's beautiful. The 9th edition is not yet on paper, but you can read the entire book online. It's a very colorful, well-illustrated book, and you have to believe in God to go with his edition, but I do, and I think that it has more merit really than the regular tectonic plates. He deals with the way the earth was created and how the flood took place with this. And it explains a lot of the stuff in the Bible. So, Jerry, again, I want to thank you for your presentation, and God bless you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll look at that. I'm still working my way, my second reading of Brian Stubbs' book, so.
Don't see anybody else with their hand up unless they're doing it off screen, so. Paul, you got any more questions? You're muted, Paul. There you are.
There you go. Jerry, I am most appreciative of your presentation, and I find myself intrigued by the application that it offers through the Tuxtla Mountains down in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And I'm anxious to hear your summary on the swords of Shul, because your explanations there, and so and that will expand into the line of desolation, tied it to the volcanoes, and it also correlates some of the Jaredite Olmec dates. And so I'm looking forward to another presentation on that.
Yeah, I would say probably the main crux of that book. I mean, it's all valuable in the book, I think, but I think I got a pretty good chronology, and using scientific parameters to determine the chronology of the Jaredites. So I think that's a major contribution. Again, I have maps and kind of show how it works in that area, the geography. But
I wanted to call people's attention to the idea that you do have a lot more work evident and available. And I agree that the parallels with the volcanic eruptions and the Jaredite story are something we haven't gotten to this evening. And so I'm anticipating we'll get you back to address those, because I think they really do help to understand the Jaredite story as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am amazed that we have cut this short. Here we are, it's only 10 o'clock, and we're running out of questions and comments already. How those people that are trying to get that A, I think there's more questions that should be out there. Maybe you can't find that little button down at the bottom of the screen that says reactions to raise your hand and get called on. Well, if that's the case, then it might be that somebody want to go watch the Olympics or something, and so we could close down for this evening. But let's do so with a hand of applause for Jerry. I think this is a remarkable demonstration of kind of genius that we've been so blessed with on the forum. And next week we have Hannah Sariak coming. She'll be supporting your claim, Ed, that the Heartland theory is politically motivated rather than geologically based.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with her totally, but I mean, I know where she's coming from, but I've met a lot of great people that are Heartlanders. They aren't all
well
related to neo-Nazi, whatever she's kind of said.
When you take people's perspectives, you get a bit of overload some places, but we try to treat each other with respect and a certain amount of friendliness, even if we disagree and sometimes can hardly stand what they're saying. I grew up in Iowa. I've dug for years at Nauvoo, and to me, the idea of having Montrose be Zarahemla is preposterous. I mean, no Burn City there, the best I can tell, and I don't see it fitting very well. And matter of fact, I'm confident that I have read somewhere of people that fled Caldwell County and went north to Iowa, then east to settle along the river, and they called that place Zarahemla. Unfortunately, I've not been able to retrace that. I thought maybe it was the Condit family, and I've contacted the Condit family to check that. Doesn't seem to work. Somewhere in my, if any of you else have come up with other people, but there was somebody in history who went north out of the Caldwell County when the governor issued his extermination order, but then crossed over to the Montrose area, and they used the term Zarahemla for it, I think 1839.
My goodness, I had not heard that. That's good.
But I
Good information. Well, we'll find it.
found it, and so yeah, I did find that Joseph Smith made reference to Zarahemla in December of 1840, before the revelation in March of 1841. But there's some question about whether that was done beforehand or afterhand, and so I understand that the research on that allows them to still maintain the benchmark of if Joseph Smith said it, then must be. On the other hand, because I have dug and worked on Joseph Smith properties in Nauvoo for much of my life, then I am highly skeptical of anyone who considered Joseph Smith to be infallible.
right.
Well, the other thing is, the Heartlander, you gotta give them credit. They have great marketing. So
What
the
do they? That's right.
Mesoamerican people are put to shame, to be honest with you. So,
Well, we don't have an axe to grind. I think the Heartland theory they have an axe to grind. They're trying to defend the ownership of that hill in New York that they call Cumorah. And if you've got that as Cumorah, then you've got to somehow fix all of the geography of the Book of Mormon in that area.
yeah.
It just doesn't fit. I've got one book that's beautifully bound and beautifully color and everything on the cover. And it has all of the Book of Mormon lands within about 300 miles of that area. And the lakes are the West Sea and the East Sea. And there's an East Sea over there in the middle of Pennsylvania, I believe, that doesn't even exist on the map that they have. It's just an irrational map, really. But that's where they try to fit everything. And if they try to use the narrow neck between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario as that narrow neck, that's the one that Niagara Falls goes over. And if that had truly been the narrow neck, I can't imagine them not mentioning that great waterfall of Niagara in the book. I mean, talk about a landmark. You can hear it miles away. Anyway, just my opinion.
I'm hard pressed to justify it, but I appreciate that we have good people like Jonathan Neville, who has been persuaded by some portions of it, at least. I'm intrigued that we have DNA evidences that seem to be supporting, linguistic evidences that might be supportive. And so the simple fact that we have lots of unanswered questions means that I'm in hopes that our Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum can help us to sort out and come to better understandings and at least get more information before us. And I think tonight we've done that. I really appreciate that the geological background is something that, well, it's a little bit like when Josh Gailey was on. He emphasized that you've got to have a state, you've got to have two types of writing. You have to have an area that is comparatively limited, probably not more than 500 miles length by a couple hundred miles wide. And just simply looking at those basics here, and he pointed out that you've got to have the production of gold and silver. And these are things that the Mesoamerican proposal covers reasonably well. Heartland has difficulty. But the people that study Heartland do have lots of hidden evidences that are worth understanding, and we don't understand the Adena that well. Hopewell, I think we're understanding a little bit better, but in terms of cities, in terms of writing, in terms of making a total map that matches, I think they are hard pressed. But nonetheless, I'm very anxious for them to have a chance to present and for all of our perspectives to be seen and heard.
Well, I think, part of it is what took place and where the Book of Mormon took place doesn't mean there weren't, like Brian has mentioned, there weren't migrations and different things. So you may see cultural things far away from Mesoamerica that
absolutely
that match Book of Mormon things. That's why I've never said don't do research. Do research on Heartland. Do research on whatever you want. You may find some things that actually are supportive of the Book of Mormon too. Outside of the core area where the main things took place. So.
My brother David has his hand up, and he's preparing a presentation on the Olson proposal for Malaysia, and that one to me is going to be a fascinating presentation. Even though it's not well considered by many people, you begin looking at the research, and there's some remarkable parallels. And I am considering following that with another presentation on the universal archetypes to show the patterns that do pervade across the whole bunch of these proposals. David has his hand up. Let's give him a chance.
I find it fascinating that Jesus told the Book of Mormon people, other sheep I have that are not of this fold. Do lots of things with that.
You can go all the way to Tahiti with that.
I wish I was one of those ships.
And you know, David, what's so interesting about that is that in that same talk he gave to the people in Bountiful, he said, I told them in Jerusalem that I had other sheep and they didn't bother to ask. Then he told the Bountiful people, another sheep I have, and I noticed they didn't bother to ask either.
That's right.
But then he proceeds to identify that there are prophets that go to these other sheep. And I believe
Right.
start looking at the tracks of the prophets and the messages of other world religions, to begin to find some parallels that are quite remarkable. And so it may be that there's a bigger Zion ahead of us than what many of us have been thinking.
All I've got to check out, I have at 9 o'clock. I'm a couple minutes late for, so.
All right, well, thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay, thanks.
Appreciate it.
We'll see you.
Bye.
Happy Valentine's.
Thank you. Happy Valentine. Bye-bye.
Buenas noches.
All right, Rena's saying it's time to say goodnight. So good night. The Lord is watching over you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you.
Good night.
Thanks,
Good night.
guys.
Buenas
See
noches.
you next week.